Do a welcome. Excellent. All right. Well, look, thanks everybody for joining us for this semi-impromptu but quite well planned discussion about CODATA's WorldFAIR Plus and Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. I'd like to start by, I'm Tim Rolling. I'm the CEO of AuScope, for those that don't know me. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today virtually. So for those of us in Melbourne, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And for those of you in Canberra, I believe you're on Ngunnawal country. If you're from somewhere else, please feel free to add it in the chat. But I would like to acknowledge elders past and present and recognise that Indigenous people were the first observers and curators of knowledge about the lands on which we live and work. As Beck's already said, we are recording this meeting, so if you're uncomfortable with that, please keep your camera off, and we will be making the recording available for those that were unable to join us. So we've got a star-studded cast for you here today. We have Dr. Simon Hodson, who I'm sure is the big draw card. He's the Executive Director of CODATA, and he was really the brains trust behind the WorldFAIR project, which really impacted the way AuScope thinks about data and much of the way about that many of those in the sort of NCRIS and National Research Infrastructure community think about data. So welcome, Simon. We look forward to hearing your presentation. We also have Steve McEachin, who was the head of the Australian Data Archive at ANU, but has since been appointed the Director of UK Data Service. And he was also instrumental in that WorldFAIR project. And finally, we've also got Rebecca Farrington, who's the Director of Research Data Systems at AuScope. I'm sure you all know Beck. And she's sort of responsible for rolling out the WorldFAIR approach to geoscience data in Australia and within AuScope. And starting with pods, and we've actually also got Angus and Bryant on the call here today, who just received some funding to start rolling out pods across our geochemistry community. Finally, she might not be speaking, but Leslie Wyborn is also here, and she's really the connector, and she's sort of a Machiavellian presence for good, working in the shadows to improve the way we manage scientific data in Australia. So thank you, Leslie, for doing the groundwork that made this presentation. So with that, I'll hand over to Simon, who's going to give the first part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much to Leslie and Rebecca and Tim and everyone involved for organising this at short notice. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about WorldFAIR and where we're going next with that. So there's a very quick introduction to CODATA. CODATA is a membership organisation. What we try to communicate in this slide is that we are a membership organisation, we remain a membership organisation, but we're making great efforts to expand our secretariat so that we can deliver more to our members and that we can be thought leaders in a number of areas of activity. So we aim to leverage that membership model, to leverage that network of expertise, but also develop a skilled secretariat that we can deliver that work. That slide indicates what our membership is formed of: national members who are data organisations or academies, international scientific unions, and that's really important for our link to the International Science Council and that world of international scientific organisations. And we also engage a great deal with the UN system and other intergovernmental agencies which are listed there, and our mission and vision are on that slide as well. Could you skip forward 2 slides, please? Thanks. I realise I put these in the wrong order, so it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then we'll go as normal. I wanted to communicate after that introductory slide that 10 years ago, CODATA had an executive director and an assistant. Now we have a team of 15 people around the world that work on various projects that we're funded to do. We have a core secretariat, which is there on the left, of how many people now? Is 9 people in various roles. But we've been able to expand that through engagement with various projects and project funding. Our engagement with projects internationally means that we're able to engage in paid work as consultants, a team as well, which is on the right. I'm only seeing half the screen now. I don't know. Yes. So we have colleagues on a large project in East Africa looking at population health, and that includes 2 young African data scientists that are employed by CODATA, Dorothy and Letitia, and Jay, who's managing them and mentoring them. So this has been very exciting over the last 2 to 3 years to be able to expand this team and to be able to do a lot of work through WorldFAIR, through the follow-on WorldFAIR Plus projects, which I'll explain, to implement some of the ideas that we developed in the build-up to WorldFAIR and in WorldFAIR itself. Could you go back 1 slide? Sorry about that. So this is the following. What are we trying to implement? These are the 3 categories that we use to describe our strategy: making data work for global grand challenges, and under that comes the WorldFAIR work, the follow-on work with CDIF. The other categories are areas that we've done a lot of work in as well, promoting data policies. We have an international data policy committee, and we engage with international intergovernmental organizations, the UN system, to advance data policies, whether that's the FAIR principles or open science. And we're also developing activities on data science and AI for science. That includes training and skills. It includes conferences, our journal, but also some more specific activities in relation to data science and AI and how we harness those technologies for the benefit of science. Now, if we can go forward, making data work and WorldFAIR. Next slide, please. So everything needs some development. Things don't just don't spring into life. There's often a long history in the work that we do. This idea of making data work for global grand challenges was developed in conjunction with ICSU, as then was, with what became the International Science Council. And they asked CODATA to develop a program to support interdisciplinary grand challenge research. It is hard enough to make data for a given discipline interoperable. How on earth do we do that when in contexts where we need to support interdisciplinary research for grand challenges? So from a series of workshops in 2017, we developed a really good collaboration with the Data Documentation Initiative, a series of Dagstuhl workshops, some of which are the photos at the bottom, and developed a set of ideas about how we might go about this work. Next slide, please. And then on the back of that, on the back of some of that thinking, we were able to obtain the WorldFAIR project from the European Commission. And that was, thanks for Tim saying the Brains Trust. The Brains Trust was very broad. It included a number of people that I listed in the CODATA Secretariat, Arafan Gregory in particular. It included colleagues from the DDI Alliance, and it included a lot of people from the WorldFAIR case studies, which I'll go on to describe. But that really allowed us to advance our work and our thinking about interoperability as such, about the implementation of the FAIR principles, and about interoperability in cross-domain circumstances. With the end of that project, we felt that we'd made considerable steps forward, and it was important to carry on that work. And with a lack of imagination, we've called that WorldFAIR Plus. Next slide, please. So WorldFAIR, it was a blast. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did. I'm always heartened when I hear Tim and Rebecca saying things about the influence that the project had on AuScope thinking and the opportunity, I think, that it provided. It was a very important piece of funding from the European Commission. because there were no or very few geographical restrictions on the beneficiaries we could have. Essentially, we were able to design and to conduct a global project with partners in New Zealand, 2 partners in Australia, partners in Brazil, in Kenya, in the US, and in countries, other countries outside the European Union. And I think that sort of funding, to be frank, is really far-sighted and is a fantastic thing to have. Because research and the things upon which research depends, such as data standards, data models, data structures, and all these things that are essential for interoperability are fundamentally international. So we do need that international collaboration, and for the European Commission to step forward and fund a project like that, I think was great. I do fear that in the current geopolitical climate, as we say, that sort of funding is going to be harder to come by, but any lobbying we can to encourage international alignment and joint funding of such activities is really important. Next slide, please. So WorldFAIR took a very case study oriented approach. This diagram became our logo, and I really enjoyed that as well, that we tried to express something which became our logo. We had 11 case studies, which was incredibly ambitious. We encouraged each of those case studies to do their own work and to develop recommendations and implementation plans for their research areas, while also engaging with a central coordinating activity led by CODATA on engagement synthesis, recommendations, and FAIR assessment. We used a methodology called FAIR implementation profiles to understand how each case study was addressing or responding to the FAIR principles. But then we encouraged the case studies to develop their own solutions, while at the same time, that synthesis activity worked a lot on policy recommendations and on what became the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. Next slide, please. So this is a list of outputs. There's a summary of the achievements of the project. There's a list of the recommendations, guidelines, implementation examples from the 11 case studies, and that's an incredibly rich set of material to have come out of what was not an enormous project in terms of funding levels. So I think that was a really fantastic achievement on behalf of all of the case studies. We described our experience using FAIR implementation profiles, and for anyone who's interested in that methodology and that approach, I think there's interesting material there. And then there's the policy recommendations and the cross-domain interoperability framework. Next slide, please. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the policy recommendations. There's one very important recommendation that we made. I hope that participants in this webinar will look at that document. One key recommendation we made was that it's really important, it's essential that we have a cultural and technical shift from what we might call a bibliographic approach to data stewardship, where we treat data like a book that's put on a shelf with discovery metadata and little else other than a README file inside the package, to a data engineering practice where we look in detail and we provide detailed information about the objects of interest, about the variables, and we treat the data as something to be deconstructed and reconstructed and combined. And that's why we use that metaphor of a data engineering practice. There's a lot more information and evidence behind those arguments in that document and in the WorldFAIR outputs. Next slide, please. And now I'll introduce the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. It's a set of recommendations to achieve the implementation of the FAIR principles, but it doesn't follow slavishly the FAIR principles. It identifies a set of technical and functional requirements for data integration relating to the FAIR principle. So for interoperability with a use case that you want to combine data from a given discipline or across disciplines for specific research questions. It is categorically not a new standard. We didn't invent anything, but what we did in that report was point to what we feel is a set of emerging cross-domain, or perhaps better expressed, domain-neutral standards, which can be used in conjunction to achieve those functional requirements. And we do feel that there's a bit of an opportunity and a zeitgeist, if we can say that, because of the emergence of those domain-neutral standards and their availability and their increasing use. Next slide, please. So CDIF, in the first version of CDIF that came out of the WorldFAIR project, we identified 5 functional requirements: discovery, access, how do we manage access to data where there are sensitivities, how do we deal with controlled vocabularies, how do we describe data in a way that makes it easier to decompose and recompose or to integrate for particular research purposes, and how do we deal with what we call universals, which are often the linkages between particular data sets. That's often time and place. An important factor is units of measurement and the interoperability of those, but there can be also a set of core concepts that are often used to combine data sets, and we started a discussion about that. The original report was submitted to the European Commission, and then we turned that into an online reference, a guidebook, if you like, or a playbook called the CDIF book, which is available at that URL. It includes those recommendations. It includes samples and examples and examples of code, and it's really designed to guide a user through the recommendations and to be practitioner oriented. And we've had some very good feedback on that approach as well. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I'd like to talk about the discovery profile and the integration profile. The discovery profile, so discovery metadata, a lot of work has been done that. One might ask, do we need more statements on discovery metadata? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. So we propose a content model, a set of fields that we recommend and that are required and recommended. Examples of JSON-LD serialization, using schema.org vocabulary, but also with a mapping to DCAT and workflows for publication. And then the very simple step forward, which is innovative and yet far too late, which is the recommendation that the discovery metadata should include variable descriptions, on the premise that what do researchers really look for? What do they need in a data set? They want to know whether this data set has measured or observed certain things. It's not enough to say this is a data set about biodiversity. We want to know what precisely has been observed. And so we recommend the use in the discovery metadata of schema.org variable measured or an equivalent as a key part of that discovery metadata. And that we think that's a very simple step forward, which will help in discovery and the reuse of data. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last slide in this little set of introductions of what came out from the WorldFAIR project and what came out of it. The data description profile. So here we use DDI's cross-domain interoperability, cross-domain integration data standard, which has 3 features. I will talk really just about 2 of them. It has a component that describes the structure of the data set, whether it's a tabular data set, whether it's a long data set of time series, whether it's key value pairs, which is used in big data, or whether it's a multidimensional data model. And that information is really important for the task of decomposing and recomposing the data set, of treating the variables and the variables and values as atomic things that can be recombined. So that's really essential and important for data integration. The other key feature of DDI CDI is the variable cascade, which establishes a semantic link between the concept and the conceptual variable, how that variable is described, and its implementation in the data with a unit of measurement and any other additional constraints that those data that might be applied to those variables. That information, again, is really important for interoperability and for the combination of data sets. And we feel that DDI-CDI makes an important step forward in that respect and can also be used in conjunction with emerging standards like IADOC to describe those complex variables. So we feel with CDIF that we've made a very useful contribution to thinking about interoperability and combinability or integration of data, and we've provided the basis of a guide or playbook for how to do that. And all that work came out of that engagement and the learnings that we gathered from the WorldFAIR case studies. Next slide, please. I think that's the last. Yes. So I think at this point I hand over to Steve, who led one of the WorldFAIR case studies.
I'm just going to refresh the slides. Off you go, Steve.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. And apologies, folks. So we had a last-minute emergency we discovered. I arrived from the UK 2 days ago, and I'm going to Brisbane tomorrow, so I had time zone mismatch, I have to say. So we did the social surveys work package within the WorldFAIR program. This was a collaboration between the Australian Data Archive, where I was director until last year, and SICT, which is the Norwegian Social Science Data Archive and part of the broader infrastructure in Norway. And our sort of collaboration looks a bit like the combination of AAF, ARNet, and the Data Archive as well. Colleague Ryan Perry is also on the call here and was involved in the project as well. So the social surveys package we were looking at sort of data integration within the social surveys domain here, really focusing on what happens when you try to do interoperability within a domain, but between countries, as an example. So as a comparative study of the data management, harmonization, and integration practices of one of the satellite countries and the core European Social Survey, which is a big multinational survey of European countries and part of the European ERIC social science infrastructure. So it was leveraging the fact that we were participating, bringing one of the EU infrastructures in with an Australian case and looking at some comparative analysis with content that was designed actually to be integrated. So, in theory and in the planning and collection of the data, this was designed in advance to fit together. So the exercise was to see, well, what happens when you try and actually put that in place in terms of machine actionability? So we looked at administrative procedures, data and metadata management, and technical environments, and leveraged the DDI metadata standards, some of which Simon's just been talking about, to understand how multinational collections could be made interoperable, increasingly interoperable and reusable through shared procedural and technical development, and establish a set of guidelines and tools for the development of cross-national collections into the future. A number of the EU investments and a number of the projects that we're often involved in the social sciences often involve essentially comparative social work, understanding differences in policy and cultural outcomes between countries and how they interact. So data exchange is a 60 to 70 year heritage of that, but increasingly, how do we facilitate that in a much more streamlined way? Next slide, please. So essentially, we worked our way through current practices of the two archives, how we work together. We have a lot of data information exchange, we have a lot of common practices, but this was specifically outlaying a workflow for how that harmonization process might work. And there was a whole work around current and best practice in the area. And this is essentially the process we tried to evaluate and the sort of a signaling of what actually works when you try and put some of this into practice, with the aim of the human interoperability is relatively easy. What happens when you try and actually look at machine interoperable services for doing this harmonization with data that's been collected from humans and processed by humans? There is a lot of human interaction in the data pipelines in the social sciences for collecting surveys. So so we have to take the sort of the human interaction into account, but increasingly look at how we can standardize those processes. So it's not a particularly complex process. Pre-designed harmonization, common content using the framework, that variable cascade that Simon referenced, is essentially the model that we're looking at there. This is really the actual hands-on coding and integration process that we use, and it's tended to be a very manual or scripted, human scripted using statistical packages process. What we wanted to see, what we did have though, is at either end of the systems, increasingly common processing environments and registries for content. So what worked and what didn't? Well, let's say in the process itself, we fell at the first hurdle. Simply getting a lot of our systems designed to actually have mediated process for data access. And we could do things like I could log in from Australia into the Norwegian registries. I could use all the EduRoam and EduGain systems for single sign-on. But when we start looking at API access to that, the fact that at either end those weren't designed for that, it falls over. It's not a complex thing, but it's an inhibitor along the way. Second, so simple, but it does start to point to what happens in sort of streamlining these workflows. Secondly, the harmonization of the concepts themselves. We pre-designed the concepts. 40 people sit around a table and design a survey. But the concepts of interest were clear. We knew where the data was coming from. Part of the challenges was saying, well, what does the endpoint target variable start to look like? Ideally, we'd have a registry of this is a target variable and everything should essentially be aligned on codes and categories to that area. That turned out to be a more complex process than it ought to have been. Essentially, we had a shell spreadsheet to fit things into. We should be able to do a more standardized way of looking at that. Once that's in place, though, harmonizing names, harmonizing content, essentially most of the content here is extracted from there's a sort of an industry format, but it's essentially a spreadsheet with metadata, embedded metadata using the SPSS or R statistical packages. They all sort of align fairly easily. It's just a matter of saying this equals this, if-then statements, essentially. It's a fairly simple coding exercise. Where we did start hitting problems, though, and we essentially didn't take any further, is what happens if you've encoded data types in different ways. Differences in handling missing values. And one group's using R, another was using Python, another one was using SPSS. The encoding of the data types themselves gets in the way of the integration. You can do it, but again, you have to kind of understand your way through the harmonization process and then generating the documentation of the harmonization. It works, but there's a lot of manual processing that's in there. So the point being here is we have a framework for starting to think about what the integration might be and some targets for seeing where the pain points are. And that was really the feed into the more general CDIF process. Next slide, please. Say summarizing, what worked and what didn't, and kind of where probably the focus needs to be looking forward. Human practices and best practices and broadly agreed human workflows generally are pretty consistent. There's a lot of information and knowledge exchange in the community. We have common organizational structures, essentially built around the OAIS repository models, common processing, and increasingly a shared set of technologies, a mix of open and commercial products, but there are a limited number of products that we're working from. The inconsistency is then in the processing technologies at the point of harmonization itself. Differences in software, differences in the development of curation code and syntax, which is essentially encoding those human practices vary, and that produces some challenges in the outcomes. And then really at the level of moving systems that have intended to be for human interaction to machine operability, is, say, particularly curation. That's really where we're seeing the machine operability creating a bit of a challenge. That's led to us thinking increasingly and looking forward into WorldFAIR Plus is, well, where do you essentially focus the human interaction on the things that require human understanding and interpretation, and trying to streamline the machine interoperability on the data exchanges and movements between systems. And that's it from me. I think we're moving to Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's great. We should have time at the end for some discussions, so please add them to the Q&A if you'd like. But if you'd like more information from Steve, we can talk about that then. For my portion of our talk, I've really just got two. For brevity, I'll just introduce kind of two broad kind of impacts that our community has had with our engagement with WorldFAIR. And so, firstly, so AuScope was the receiver of funds for the work package 5, which was geochemistry. So that allowed our geochemistry network, and a shout out to some of their members who are here today, Angus and Bryant specifically, who are actively involved in some of these projects, as well as Barry, who's been involved for many years in the development of this. So AuScope's geochemistry network had recently set up a data platform in response to the geochemistry network, geochemistry labs in Australia, I suppose, being very broad. This slide really indicates, it's a long tail community, so small volumes of data, but really variable. And so trying to understand how they can work together and coalesce their data resources over many years, and then looking into the future, so how they can really provide impact into the broader community, whether that's for researchers, but then also into government agencies and into industry. So our participation with WorldFAIR really allowed the relatively new AuScope Geochemistry Network that had stood up AusGeochem, now called Earthbank, data portal, to then engage with two well-established international organizations. So EarthChem, based in the US, and GeoRock, based in Europe. So those three different data systems got together and kicked off one geochemistry. And that provided, there was lots of technical work under the hood, obviously, with deliverables, etc. But for us as a community, it allowed specifically early career researchers to really get exposure to international best practice in geochemistry data, as well as then international best practice at kind of those broad, the 11 other work packages that Simon spoke of earlier. The other impact that we had for AuScope was that at the same time as WorldFAIR kicked off, we had another project in collaboration with NCI, who members are here today, as well as ARDC, who also have a few people here today, and TERN, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, which is an Australian-based research infrastructure like us. Geophysics 2030 was about trying to make sure that these large data sets that we had for geophysical data, so seismology, magnetotellurics, etc., were appropriately looked after and curated for future computation, so machine-to-machine interoperability, all the nuts and bolts of the FAIR data systems. And so we were able to leverage really in real time the developments that we were seeing in the broader WorldFAIR community. That was really the global best practice for these, for these data sets, and to import them into our geophysics learnings. So Leslie Wyborn, who's here, really worked hard in this project group, as well as Joe, who's sitting there next to Simon. And we were able to stand up, magnetotellurics data collection, for example, at NCI, looking at linking the data through different processing levels, and then also ensuring interoperability across domains. So those are two kind of pretty unique situations that we were able to kind of exploit, to use, there's a better word than exploit, but to leverage for our advantage by just, these opportunities that arise from that kind of scaling that you get with collaboration across, 11 different programs, different domains, as well as different geographical locations, and kind of key to this as well is that really different styles of data. So we were working with the two kind of end members on one scale. So one was, you know, that long tail geochemistry data where researchers are producing really a very small volume of data throughout their whole career. But geophysical data, I mean, we're processing that on high performance computing systems. The large scale data, you know, I suppose we're not quite in the petabytes yet, but some of the data sets can be, you know, hundreds of terabytes. And so that was really fundamental to, I suppose, as Tim mentioned at the introductions, to where AuScope is looking kind of now and into the future. And I think that's all I would like to add. I'd just like to throw out to Leslie. Did you want to add anything quickly, Leslie?
No, in the interest of time, let's keep going.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'll go back to Simon.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's skip through the slides to the first slide on WorldFAIR Plus. Thanks. So what is WorldFAIR Plus, other than an unimaginative name? If the European Commission were to offer us another project of that nature, where we were able to have beneficiaries and funding for partners around the world, I would metaphorically bite their hands off, and probably literally as well. It was a really fantastic experience, and I fundamentally believe in international collaboration of that sort. I also think it's really important, it's a huge privilege to be able to engage with case studies in that detailed way and to spend time understanding their data and understanding the generic aspects of their data. I have come to believe that a lot of what we feel is discipline specific in data is less discipline specific than we think, and data is data, or data are data, and let's not go there. So how do we continue that work, and how do we ensure an international approach using some of that methodology and philosophy of WorldFAIR? The best solution that we've come up with so far is to try and engineer a situation where there is a federated or coordinated set of projects which may have different funders in different parts of the world, but are linked through a coordinating function provided by CODATA and potentially other partners as well. So we've worked as hard as we can to create a situation where that is the case, and I'll describe what we're doing there. So we have 7 confirmed projects, active projects, which are part of that, or come under that umbrella of WorldFAIR Plus. I'll describe those, and we're in conversation with existing and new partners about collaborations or further projects. So there's an open invitation there for collaboration and for engagement and for partnership in projects or non-funded collaborations towards that set of goals of interdisciplinary and disciplinary interoperability, taking the WorldFAIR approach, using FAIR implementation profiles where useful, but above all, that idea of implementing, testing, refine, and extending a set of recommendations under the CDIF banner. Next slide, please. This is a list for information of the current WorldFAIR projects, which CODATA is a part of. They're all disciplinary or interdisciplinary oriented. They all in one way or another involve CDIF implementation, sometimes not the whole of the CDIF components, but they're very much continuing that WorldFAIR approach because they're all very case study oriented. They all allow us and give us that opportunity to engage in detail with the data of particular disciplines or interdisciplinary research areas, and each of them is allowing us to test and refine the CDIF recommendations. Next slide, please. So we produced this diagram at the end of the WorldFAIR project to indicate where we saw CDIF going next. Now that's over a year ago. And there's some additional detail that we would add to this, but the basic components are still there. We're doing work on context, provenance, and quality. We're doing work on mappings and extending that data description, and also work is underway on extended access and applying more than just ODRL, but the data privacy vocabulary and the data use ontology as well. But those are the areas of extension that we're really focusing on in the ongoing CDIF work. Next slide, please. And so I'll talk about two of our projects very quickly to give a flavour of what we're doing. One is an Oscars-funded project where we're applying CDIF recommendations, and in particular the discovery and the integration profiles, to X-ray absorption spectroscopy data. And it really feels like this is a continuation of WorldFAIR. It's very case study oriented. We're getting really performing a sort of detailed analysis of the data types that come out of X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and seeing how a CDIF layer of additional metadata can help with interoperability issues. Next slide, please. These are our partners and the people involved in that. Next slide, please. And this is the list of outputs that will come out of that project as well. That's all for reference. Next slide. And so what have we done so far? We've done a landscape analysis and overview of the practices in X-ray absorption spectroscopy data. I think that's a really interesting report. And what it communicates in sum is the diversity of standards in that field, the range of standards which were developed by particular facilities and efforts in that field to align around two standards, in particular NEXAS and XDI. And then the next steps, which will be published, we hope early next week, it's nearly completed, will be the semantic description of NEXAS and XDI using CDIF. So that comprises a set of mappings. It comprises a set of recommendations about how CDIF can be used to describe the headers in those standards and the data structures and the variables. And we think it's been a fascinating piece of work to be involved with, and we think it will be very useful for that field to assist with the integration and aggregation of XAS data and potentially its interdisciplinary reuse. That's a contention that we need to test, but certainly the mapping to the CDIF component seems to be plausible and implementable. Our next step with that project will then to be develop tooling around that so that that can be implemented, and to understand how this can be implemented in the sort of workflows, Galaxy workflows in particular, that are used in that domain. Next slide, please. A further project that we're involved with is a large European Commission-funded project called Climate Adapt for EOSC. That's looking at 3 particular case studies of climate adaptation. In the interest of time, I won't go into all of the details with that, but again, it's providing us with an opportunity to explore CDIF implementation. We're looking at the structure and the semantics of the various data types that need to be combined for the case studies in that project. We're looking at the packaging of data in our crates to make data more easily exchangeable. And we're also looking at issues around legal and organizational interoperability. And in particular, that means how we encode and hopefully make more machine actionable particular restrictions or obligations that are associated with the use and reuse of those data. Next slide, please. And we're also involved in a project called FAIR for DDE. And really we're pivoting that project, which has been a little bit late in starting, really got going only in August, towards implementing CDIF. And in particular, aligning current geological discovery metadata and those approaches to that discovery metadata which are used in Deep Time Digital Earth to the CDIF recommendations, and seeing whether we can implement that discovery profile and potentially some of the work that we've also done on data structure as well. So those are 3 examples of parallel projects which are allowing us to explore the implementation of CDIF in particular domains. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide. We established a CDIF working group, which, because of the work on those other projects, has gone a little bit onto the back burner, but we'll be rebooting that later this month. We're continuing to explore project and collaboration opportunities. Please do get in touch if anything that we've said about the WorldFAIR approach, the WorldFAIR Plus approach, about the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework is of interest. Please do get in touch to explore potential collaborations. And our upcoming digital workshop in November will look at provenance, context, and quality. We'll look at that access profile, which I've mentioned briefly. It'll continue the work on metadata mapping and data integration, implementing DDI, CDI, and there'll be a group that will continue the work on CDIF for XAS, and that's a really fantastic opportunity for us, and we'll report on that in due course. And I think that's the last of my slides.
Thanks so much, Simon. It's really great to hear all of the details. And I suppose also the open and collaborative nature of the work going forward is really, really wonderful. And I find the accessibility of WorldFAIR and the CDIF working groups really wonderful. We do miraculously have time for discussions. So, yeah, more than happy. We've got a question here in the chat, which I'll go to in just a moment. But please either put a question in the chat or raise your hand, either physically or with the icon, and we can get to those. Okay, yeah, so Anitra asks, Earthbank is very impressive. Curious about any other future work in One Geochemistry, please. So I'm not sure who's best to answer that, but Angus has just taken his...
I've just put the link to the website in the chat, One Geochemistry. I think we can make it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. I'll swing to Angus, who's based at the University of Adelaide and is Deputy Chair of One Geochemistry. Is that their title?
Co-chair, yes. So it's all the same.
Excellent.
Too much responsibility is, yeah. Yeah, thanks. So at the moment, I guess our biggest focus through One Geochem is to kind of better align the various, Rebecca talked about the various large data platforms, so EarthChem and Diga's GeoRock. So one of the large initiatives large projects we've got at the moment is sort of doing working on having things like common vocabularies and resources. I guess sort of at the moment we're starting from that sort of techniques, analytical techniques level. So hopefully we can have a shared, have a shared resource that all of those systems use to allow them to talk to each other and share data more seamlessly. I guess ultimately where we want to get to is, the dream would be to start matching vocabularies and schemas up and establishing crosswalks so that we can actually start to either have some sort of central place where you can central data resource where you can pull all of the data from the various systems, or either share them across systems. That's sort of up for debate exactly what is the best way forward. But yeah, a lot of that work at the moment is in either creating or starting to map across the vocabularies and schemas that we all use within those systems. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Angus. That's great. Yeah, is there any other specific questions?
Rebecca, I just put in the chat the methods directory that Angus talked about that we've developed in One Geochemistry. It's very much a preliminary, and I would like to spend time talking with Simon, because we realised, again, getting down to that atomic level, this table we've developed as a first pass is a mixture of methods and techniques. How do we piece these out? And that's, again, another example of the advantage of being with a group like One Geochemistry and with WorldFAIR, because that got us in contact with International Union of Pure and Applied Chemists And I also think some of this work that's going on in that was X-ray project, the Oscars project, to get some cross-links to that will be very useful.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. It's true. Would anyone else like to ask any questions or have any comments? If not, I can throw the discussion into, Steve, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, Simon, I just wonder, I mean, you sort of briefly mentioned climate adapt. I just think it might, given the two groups in particular we have kind of represented here, it might be worth just saying a little bit more about climate adapt. It's about bringing essentially remote sensing and social data together.
Yeah, I sort of skipped over. I didn't explain the 3 use cases in that project, and I'll take the opportunity now. And I was just thinking about time really. So climate adapt allowed us to engage with 3 particular use cases, which are very varied. They're all in one way or another climate adaptation, but quite distinct areas of research, and each with a sort of policy relationship as well. So one of them is about urban heat, but also urban pollution. That's combining various climate data sets with social science data sets, economic development data set, so physical urban environment data set, and doing a sort of data integration task so that we can map and model the impacts of urban heat, and we can model potential responses to that. So there's a lot of data integration work there, fundamentally between climate data and social sciences data, but also including citizen focus groups and the like. The other one is about oceans data, and in particular wave overtopping on the Portuguese coast, as it happens. So that's the oceans modeling. It's modeling the wave function. It's a predictive system which will predict when there will be overtopping in that part of the coast. So a lot of that is that modeling data, but it does also relate to the physical and urban data of the coastal communities. And then the third one is shrink swell of clay soils. This is French-based. It uses data sets from the French Geological Survey on the soil, and where the clay soils are, and it models the impact of climate, in particular precipitation or lack of precipitation, on the shrinkage or swelling of those clay soils and their impact on the built environment. So there's also insurance data related there. Now we're working there with a private company who wants to produce a public version of this resource, so that people can look up what the potential threat is to their home or building, and a private paid for version. And so we've got to tackle issues there around the openness or not of the data. So each of those case studies allows us to explore the data integration aspects, to look in detail at the structures and the semantics around those various data types, to consider the restrictions and obligations that are involved and that have to be overcome when we do that data integration and when we make those services available in various forms. Hopefully that's given a little bit more idea of the detail involved there.
I think it does, Simon. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We have 1 minute left. So if anyone has any kind of short, quick questions or comments, we have some time. Otherwise, Simon, did you have some closing remarks?
Speaking too much, I want to come back to this, to what Leslie said about the analytical methods. I mentioned that we're looking a lot about what we're using the working title context. So the context in which created the data, provenance, which is the subset of that in many respects, and quality, how we pass on quality information to an end user. A significant part of that is being able to communicate the methods and the technique, potentially, if the semantics there are different, of how those data were created, so that the end user can make an informed decision of what data is in or out in the particular aggregation that they would want to use. There's obvious use cases where you would want to gather data on a given subject produced by a given method, and you would not want to include data produced by an alternative method. And you would need to be able to make that decision, make that distinction, and you'd want to be able to do that in an efficient way rather than manually searching the associated article, which might describe how the data set was created. That requires that each discipline produce precisely that sort of list of methods, that canonical list which can be used in metadata as part of the minimal information standard around the data in that discipline. And so work there to encourage that sort of, or encouraging that sort of work, I think is really important.
Yeah, agreed, Simon. Thank you. Okay, so we've gone 1 minute over. Did you have any further closing remarks, Simon, before I throw to Tim?
No, Linda, thank you very much for organising this. It's great to see everyone again, and it's greatly appreciated the ongoing opportunity to have a conversation about these topics.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I agree. I think we always appreciate your accessibility, so thank you for making the time. I know it's a very busy couple of weeks for you. I'll pass back to Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Beck. And look, thanks to Steve, Beck, and to Simon for presenting. It's great to sort of refresh what we did back in the day and where we're at with this stuff, and it's exciting to see where it's going forward. So thank you all for making the time, and thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope to see many of you next week in Brisbane.